both of you, both of you to tell us a little bit about yourself and your work, and it is your preference on who goes first for that. So, Daniel or Nick, whichever one of you wants to go first, we can do that.
I'll let Nick go first.
Oh, thank you.
Okay.
Well, my name's Nick
Oh, sorry.
Cagnetti. I'm a cartoonist.
Can I pause
Uh,
you 1 second?
are we good?
Sorry, I just want to make sure that we can introduce everybody here before we get started fully. You guys should have.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, no worries, no worries. Just wanted to make sure that we got everything going strongly. So, okay, I'm going to officially start the interview right now. Hello, watchers and listeners. My name is Sophie Applin. I am the Assistant Director for Pine Reads Review, and I am joined by Vinny and Daniel and Nick. Daniel and Nick run the comic company Radical Realm, which is a place for both their work and others, and we are so happy to get to talk to them today about their work and their experience in the publishing industry. Nick, would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. I'm a cartoonist. I write and draw comic books. I guess most people probably know me for my Pink Lemonade stuff, which is finally coming out again from Oni Press, and excited to see people get their hands on those books and see what they think of them.
Yeah, awesome. And Daniel?
That's about it.
Yeah, my name is Daniel Ziegler. I'm a writer. I work with both comics and films. So I do all kinds of different writing. I worked with Nick on a comic called The Spirit of the Shadows that was released quite a while ago now, back when we were both in college. So we've both worked together on a lot of creative projects over the years, both comics and independent films. And yeah, excited to talk to you guys.
Yeah, awesome. So I think to kind of get started with from the very beginning, how did both of you get into comic books in the first place?
Well, I'd say just from like reading them from very young age. For me, it was sort of how I learned to read to begin with. Honestly, just getting lots of old Spider-Man comics. I think the big one was that they would have those reprints that were black and white, like phone book size things called Essentials, and it had like all the earliest books in there, and I those would be my earliest experiences with just like the medium and just like trying to read in general, and doing that from a young age, you just sort of you find yourself like wanting to be drawn into that stuff too. So you end up like making your own stuff along the way, and it just sort of keeps going from there. Honestly, started in high school trying to do comic books proper, and just went from there.
Yeah, that's awesome. How about you, Daniel?
Similar to Nick, I loved Spider-Man as a kid, so that was a good foray into comics. But Nick, meeting him in middle school, I think it was, his passion for comics kind of bled over into mine because he was a big influence on getting me into that world of comics. And obviously, he has always been a brilliant artist. So as we got older, I think it was kind of just convenience that I was someone who was very interested in writing, and he was someone who was very interested in drawing. That we were able to sort of team up and say, well, let's try to do something together. And that's sort of how the actual production of it came to be.
Yeah, that's really awesome.
Sophie, if it's all right, I think I'll ask a couple questions now.
Yeah.
All right. So, was The Spirit of the Shadows the first like real, like solid project that the two of you kind of combined those talents on, or was there something before that, or tell us about that process?
Well, I'd say we were working on stuff before that together, but that was like our first real project working on comics together. We'd been working on short films together for fun through the years before that, but I was doing some comic book work with one of our other buddies, and just sort of went from there. Daniel had a script he was working on, and he just sent it over to me. He's like, "What do you think of this?" I'm just thought, well, let's see what we can do with that.
Yeah, the interesting thing about The Spirit of the Shadows is it actually started out as a short film screenplay. It wasn't a comic. And it was something that I was writing, and it just got so big for what we were able to do with our limited budgets that I kind of tabled it. And then as time went on, we were both interested in that story, and we thought that the comic book medium would be a great way to tell that story in a way that we could kind of do those crazy, bigger scope stuff without having to, pay for it to make it in real life like a short film. So it was an interesting adaptation of a previous idea. And yeah, it was our first time working directly together on a comic book, although Nick had done some prior work that I helped out with a bit here and there. But yeah, it was our first major work done together in comic books, at least.
And Daniel, where did the idea for Spirit of the Shadows, just as a story before it was like particularly a screenplay or a comic, where did that come from?
It definitely came out of my love for classic horror, classic monsters. The original Frankenstein, Dracula, Wolfman. I've always loved those kinds of movies, and also a bit of the horror comics, the EC comics. Vault of Horror. Those kinds of things were always a big interest of mine. I've always loved horror, but I've always thought that horror has kind of evolved to a point nowadays where it's not as accessible as it used to be. It's a lot more intense, it's a lot more brutal and violent, and I kind of wanted to do something that harkened back to a time when it was more simple, it was more character based, it was more fun overall. And that was a big part of what I was trying to do with that original story, was make my version of one of those classic 1930s, 1940s monster movies.
I definitely see that, especially compared to like other like comics in the horror genre. Yours is much more toned down. Like there is some violence, there is some outright murder, but it's much more done in like a
Right.
like literally Nick's style is cartoony, so it's very cartoony.
Yeah,
Like, oh,
I think it was a great marriage of my interests and Nick's style to present kind of a macabre story in a way that's not brutal and hard to read, or hard to watch, or hard to look at. It's kind of like a melodramatic cartoon, kind of like a soap opera, with all the fun sort of spooky horror elements that I've loved. And I think it's an interesting blend of that I've always been pretty proud of.
Yeah, my whole mission statement with making comics in general is just trying to make them as fun as I can, and like have as much fun with them as I can. Because I mean, they are a heck of a lot of work to do, so you gotta like make it fun for yourself, you know? But yeah, I mean, I generally my interest in making things, I don't want to make them too like violent and stuff just for myself. Like I don't really want to be like too mean to the characters and stuff, like more than they're already going through, you know. It's but it's fun. That's the bottom line for me. And yeah, that book was a weird thing, because like I was at a point in my artistic development where I was really getting a chance to let go off the rails a bit in terms of the layouts and how the story is going to flow. I was doing a lot of really weird things, and I've heard people equate that to like every artist's journey is sort of like they have those points where they're just throwing everything at the wall and seeing what sticks. And like that's I feel like Spirit of the Shadows is like that for me. But I own it like a badge of honor because it was a very fun thing to do.
I think that's a good transition into Sophie's question. You had a question about storyboards and kind of like the visual layout, Sophie?
Yeah, I'm really curious, especially since I am not super familiar with the process of creating comic books. What does that begin with? Do you lay out a storyboard? Do you write the piece first and then create the art later? Or can you kind of tell us a little bit about what that process is like?
All right.
So
Well,
I'll start with the writing and then we'll
yeah,
segue into when you took over. So
perfect.
yeah, it all starts with a script where I kind of lay out about how many panels I think a page is gonna be and what happens in each of them and the dialogue. And then I don't think of that as like cemented. I think it was kind of a loose interpretation, especially since it was my first time writing a comic. I wasn't probably following industry standard, but I would plot out the story and then hand it over to Nick, and then I'll let him take over with what he did from that point.
Yeah, I think that's like the best kind of way to go about it. If you're like, having somebody write and then having somebody draw is having it be sort of open with the collaboration, like not having it set in stone and being like open to be fluid with the way that it's going to look on the page. And that's sort of how it felt for me, at least, like approaching this was I would do sketches of all the pages, thumbnail sketches. That's how I go from reading the script and then doing that and show it to Daniel, and he'd be like, he'd take a look at it from there. And then after you do the sketches, you draw the actual page. Um, it's a bit of a different process at some points when if you're like handling all of it on one person. Like for Pink Lemonade, I write and draw that one, so it's those ones. It's just more like I'm doing the full script and then doing the sketches from there. So um, I was trying to do it proper because I didn't really have much writing experience before that. So I was trying to just do it right, and it was a whole fun thing to try and learn. And by the end, I feel like I was able to get some good growth there.
Yeah, for sure. And on a side note, I am always curious to ask this when I talk with a group of artists who work on a collaborative project. Was there anything that you both disagreed on, or anything that was really tough to work with another person on when you wrote this?
Not that I can think of. I know Nick and I have worked together a lot prior to that, and since then. So I think we've found our method of working. But I think there's always minor creative differences with things, and we talk it out and try to come to a consensus. And I'll let Nick give his point of view. But in my opinion, I just think it's best to not be married to any specific idea when you're doing something creative because someone else could have a better idea. Anyone else could have a better idea. And it's about coming together and deciding on what's best for the story, not necessarily sticking to your guns. So
Yeah, for sure. You definitely got to be open to just talking through things and seeing like every possible angle. I feel like we've talked about the things like so much we can like sort of end up being on that same page at a certain point, like just innately. But I think at certain points over like many different projects, there's always those times where you pitch like an idea to someone else and they're like, I think this has happened before on several projects where we I'd like draw something wacky and I'm like, can we use this? And they're like, that's a little too out there for that one. So, in those kinds of cases, I would just store that one away in my head and keep it off to the side. And a lot of those weird, wacky things ended up in my solo Pink Lemonade work. So they all have their place. They all find their place and their time in the sunlight. So just gotta hold on to them.
Yeah, for sure. I like that. All right, Vinny, do you want to keep going?
Of course, yeah. So on the topic of Nick, you're talking about like designs and characters and such. At what point like was it Daniel's like idea for the character, like just his design, what his appearance would be, or was it more like asking Nick like what ideas he had? Because I know that especially when I first got a hold of the Spirit of the Shadows comic, there was concept art in the back, and there was a little bit more detail in the initial, concepts, and then there was more like came down to your style, but just the colors were inverted. So at what point did the Spirit of the Shadows really come into being what we know now?
Well, uh, uh, Daniel, you want to start this one out because it did start over on your end.
Yeah, it was, as I said, it started out as a short film, so it was all in text form. I'm not an artist at all, so I didn't attempt to sketch out a design. I think I did some really rough stuff on sticky notes or something. But basically, I described loosely what it was in the script, and I think there was a few things that were solidified, like a top hat and goggles. Maybe was about it. And then even back then, when it was still just a short film, I was talking to Nick about the idea, and I think he did an initial sketch, which sort of started the journey to refining it to where it is. So you can talk about that.
Yeah, the original sketch. I was in college in Arizona here, and Daniel was in New York in college, and he was telling me about this thing, and I just sent back like a random sketch, like a black top hat or something like that. I think it might have been based off of something he did on the notepad. Um, but then some point shortly after that, I thought of inverting the design so it'd be like white top hat and everything. I just thought that would be kind of fun in like a ghostly kind of way. But like the whole idea was just to sort of make like our own kind of classic monster. So for me, it's always about trying to nail a design down to like the basic elements where they'll stand out. Like I hear people say sometimes, you know, have like a silhouette and just like be able to pick that out with just the silhouette. And that's something I try to think about for sure for when I'm designing things. And I always like to try and keep them as simple as possible because I feel like it's easy to overcomplicate things, and you don't want to draw things like a million times in a book either, with like extraneous lines all over the place. In my opinion, it's it's like torturing yourself in a way sometimes.
That makes total sense. It's a little bit from picking up inspiration from your art, definitely understandable. But one more question on that topic, and then I'll go over to Sophie once again. But we've been talking a lot in the Pine Reads review about like the topic of like censorship and like, like kind of keeping things from like, keeping things out of like immediate public availability and like what stories are left untold. Was there a version of The Spirit of the Shadows, either in writing format or in visual development, that was like kind of too aggressive, coming on too strong with the horror aspect, or was it always kind of like you're keeping it tamed, or was there ever the idea that it would get more intense, anything like that might need to be censored?
Yeah, I think with this concept specifically, it was always kind of in reaction to the more intense things. So we were very conscious of not going too intense because that was the whole purpose of what we were trying to do with it. So I think in some of Nick's designs, early designs, there was a bit more of a not grotesque, but more monstrous
A little
design.
harder edge.
Yeah, but it was never to the point where I think it would be something that would need to be censored. But Yeah, every design goes through some evolutions, but I think with this specifically, it was always in our mind that we wanted this to be a accessible, fun book compared to the more gruesome stuff that's out there.
Yeah, and I mean, in general, I think that's something I'm always trying to be aware of. At least for like, I know for my solo Pink Lemonade work, I did consciously try and make that like an all ages type of story. But like, that it's a balancing act because there's certain elements you got to have where uh, for Pink Lemonade, that whole thing is like it's about somebody with like childlike sense of wonder for the world and this sort of purity, and then taking that against like the harsh realities of the real world and trying to maintain that sense of joy at the end of the day. So you got to have like that balance and treat the audience like with respect. Like it's a balancing act for sure, but it's very fun to uh, try and ride that in a way that's good for the audience. Like they feel like they're getting something out of it in an honest way.
Yeah, I'm really interested in what you said about making the stories kind of fit for all ages. So when you go about creating your work, whether for the Spirit of the Shadows or for your solo project for Pink Lemonade, do you try to imbue some themes into your work that would be accessible to both children and adult audience, or do you kind of stick with a certain art style or specific language? Like, what do you think makes your comics accessible for all different types of ages?
I'd have to say like for especially for the Pink Lemonade stuff, there was a very conscious effort of trying to blend lots of different styles and visual styles for sure. But because there's like many sequences, especially as we get further down the line of really trying different things visually. But I think thematically for things like that, Pink Lemonade was really just sort of like baked into our entertainment sort of stratosphere where it's so saturated right now with entertainment everywhere. If for decades and decades we've all grown up with this stuff, so like that was sort of the angle coming at that from, and trying to just sort of reflect on entertainment, like what it means to us and how we interact with it, and sort of look at it through like a character's lens who's going through those things, and like how would they feel if they're being like exploited by like corporations and stuff like that. I think that was an angle for me for that project, was just like engaging with the entertainment that's like entertained me so much, and then trying to like reverse engineer in my head like what does that mean to me? What does that mean to this character, you know?
And Daniel, kind of posing you the same question, is there like an overarching theme that you can, if you really had to strip away all the detail and visual from the Spirit of the Shadows, what would you say is like the ongoing theme? Because on top of being a horror story, it is also a romance. So if you had to like one sentence summary, what is the theme you think is like prominent in Spirit of the Shadows?
I think a lot of what I was trying to do is show how a normal person can become a monster through various things that may happen to them or may happen because of what they've been through. So I think a big theme of it is don't lose yourself to this idea of perfection, or you can become a monster, and you can become the very thing that you were perhaps once fighting against, because there's a character established in the comic that is the antagonist, I would say, and then by the end of the book, the protagonist is strongly mirroring the antagonist, and I thought that was a fun sort of play to show that you can get corrupted by the very thing you're trying to fight against.
Oh, yeah, very, very strong, very, very timeless for sure. So,
Yeah.
Sophie, did you have another question to go off of that, or should I go on to my next one?
I think I'm actually really curious to hear about the answers to your next question. So why don't you take it?
Okay, so you're referring to whether they were working on Pink Lemonade at the same time, or did you want to go to the next one after that?
Why don't you start with
That
that?
one? Okay, so we're curious to know, you said The Spirit of the Shadows was your first project, and I'm not sure, Daniel, your involvement in Pink Lemonade. I know, Nick, you're kind of talking about it as a solo project, but was there ever any point where you were kind of bouncing back and forth between the two, or was it like you just like you went all in on The Spirit of the Shadows until it was done? Or Nick, Daniel, either one of you could tell us about that.
Yeah, I'll just start by saying that my involvement with Pink Lemonade is basically just reading the scripts when Nick finishes them to give my thoughts, and he'll sometimes take the advice, sometimes he won't, but otherwise it's all Nick. So I'll let him talk to that.
But honestly, though, having Daniel check over my work all the time has been immensely helpful. Always have people, read your stuff for you just to be sure. It's helpful. But there was one instance where in one of the later issues where Daniel helped me out with 3D printing some little figurines because they do show up for like a page in the story later on. So that was fun little team up there. But yeah, after finishing The Spirit of the Shadows, drawing that book, that was like the most massive undertaking I had taken up until that point. It took like all of 2015 to do. So right after that, early 2016, I sort of started having like the urge to develop the Pink Lemonade stuff, and that sort of came up as comic strips originally, uh, because I was like not confident in my writing capabilities. So I was just like I needed something to like ease myself into that, and comic strips were a great way to do that because they were just like, couple panels a day, see where it goes. That was sort of how that started, was just not really having a plan, so to speak, just sort of diving in and seeing what would happen. Just force yourself to like, take that step forward with what you feel like you can do. Um, and from there, it just sort of ended at a natural point, and I went off of that from there with the main full scripted books.
So you said in
Refresh my memory,
2015,
Nick.
sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, was there a point where when we were coloring and remastering Spirit, was that while you were working on Pink Lemonade?
It when we were remastering Spirit, that was about summer of 2018. I was just starting to write the ongoing Pink Lemonade books here. I was just
Yeah.
starting to write them. I was just finishing up the strips right around then. Yeah.
The interesting thing about Spirit is that it's gone through quite a few different iterations.
Oh
As I
yeah.
said, it was originally a short film, which I then expanded into the comic story, which we made. But at that point, it was all in black and white, and we weren't super thrilled with our ability to produce a good looking comic, I guess. So then a few years later, we went back, revisited it, got better scans of Nick's original art, colored it for the first time, relettered it, and packaged it in a much better looking book, in my opinion.
And we had
And
a
then,
physical book for the first time for the whole thing then too, finally, which was
yeah,
nice.
so it's kind of been an ongoing project. It wasn't a knock it out and then it's done kind of thing. We keep coming back to it.
It's still
And
going
even
on.
right at one point, we did actually make a short film
Yeah, that
based
was
on a
fun.
small section of the story. And right now, I'm working on a feature length screenplay that I hope to one day produce. So it's a story that's kind of always been with us in different iterations.
Yeah, that script he's got is really, really good too. It's very the way I describe it is like he took the ideas that have been like in his head for so long and just like got so like as much mileage as possible out of them, like took them to their natural conclusion, like something really, really refined with it.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. I hope that one day we can see that on screen. That sounds really amazing. But kind of in that general subject of design and creating the stories, I am curious as to what the process of creating is like for each and every one, or for each and every one. There's only two of you, for each one of you. So for Daniel, in comics, this dialogue is so important. So how do you start going about that dialogue, and how do you make sure that you're writing good dialogue that gets the story across?
That's a good question. It's one of the hardest things to do in writing. What I usually do is I try to write out everything that I'm thinking of, and it's usually a little wordy. There's usually way too much, but I just kind of write whatever's coming to mind in terms of a conversation. And then I'll go back and I'll try to pull out the most important parts of it and distill it down to its basest elements. Because especially in a comic book, you don't want a lot of back and forth. You also don't want a lot of big paragraphs that take up the page. So you kind of got to get it down to its most essential pieces and make sure you're getting your point across. So it's a lot of rewriting, I would say. It starts at just a very rough, natural, blocky form, and then you go back and chop it up until it's as small and as concise as it could possibly be. And the other element to it is making sure you're ensuring different character voices, and that's pretty hard. But every character's got to have a different way of speaking. So the Spirit has kind of a more lighthearted, wordy way of talking. There's a character in there, Lord Lemley, who is a person of nobility, so they talk a lot more formal, and that sort of thing. You try to make it so that you can read the dialogue without any visual and still be able to tell who's talking. And that's one of the things that's really hard.
I imagine it would be, but I think personally, I think you did a really great job in The Spirit of the Shadows. I definitely came across. And
Thanks.
too, I'm curious about what the process is like when you're creating the art. You mentioned before that having a distinct silhouette is really important. Are there any other aspects of the art that you try to imbue in your work?
Well, I think first and foremost, like the absolute most important thing for all of this stuff is just making sure the storytelling is as clear as possible. Like at the end of the day, in the Spirit of the Shadows, I was doing like all kinds of crazy layouts and experimenting all over the place with things, but my hope at the very center of like what I was doing was just to try and make it as clear as possible through all that. And as I've gone more and more into like these other projects, I feel like I've been able to refine that a lot more and just have that meat and potato storytelling as clear as possible on the page, because I think that's important too in communicating like the characters' personalities, especially. You got to get across on the page and have them uh, be who they are, like who the dialogue is giving them that life. You got to give support that life. Um, but yeah, for me, like writing the Pink Lemonade stuff on my own is interesting because like you gotta try and she has a very unique voice way of talking, which I say is like close to how I talk on a normal basis. So it's just like me trying to insert that into a book. And what what's been interesting for me is having the book at Oni now. I have an editor over there, and I guess this is like a normal practice in comics. Is the editors will will sort of like smooth out your dialogue if it's if and believe me, I could use the smoothing out of my dialogue sometimes. So I'm very happy to have like people looking over my stuff in that regard and making it as presentable and readable as it should be. Um, that's new to me, but in a very pleasant way at these new books at Oni.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's a great transition into some of our next questions, which we'll keep brief, so not as not to take too much of your time. But we are curious about what your experience has been like in publishing so far. Now that you do have the connection with Ani Press, this is the first traditionally published story that you have had, Nick. Is that correct, or am I wrong on that?
Yeah, for the pretty much. Pink Lemonade had a publisher before a few years back. It was a even smaller one called It's Alive. Uh, they had like a more of a focus on like doing crowdfunding campaigns in tandem with doing the distribution at comic shops. But the way that the campaigns were run kind of took a toll on me personally, just because like I had no insight into what was going on, and I it was a bit stressful in that regard. So it's nice at Oni just having a full team like behind you that's working to get these things out the door, just to everybody at comic shops in that way, and that's been a relief for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And I am curious about
It's
the beginning process of getting that published. I know that a lot of traditionally published fiction authors end up having to query for an agent before they can get their manuscripts to a traditional publisher. Is that something that you had to do as well?
Um, well, I honestly just for those comic books, I was sending them in to pretty much any and every publisher out there for comic books, and you know, you don't hear from a lot of them. I did hear back from a few and got some offers, but I ended up turning down a few of them just because the contracts were just so they wouldn't budge on things, and to me that just was kind of like a red flag right off the gate, like not willing to work with you right from day one. That doesn't really bode well, you know. um, and I think that was uh, it's important to not like take like the first thing that comes to you if like it doesn't feel right sometimes. And, you know, shortly after that, I just sort of said on social media, like, hey, I've been looking for a new publisher for the series. Just FYI, everybody. And one of the editors over at Oni just saw that and sent me a message, and it sort of went from there. But even from that, it was still like a really long process just to get things through the door. But that's sort of how that initiated, which is weird to think because like there really is like no blueprint sometimes for how these things can go. It's just sort of try what you can try, and you never know what happens, honestly.
Yeah, that's wild. And Vinny, I think I accidentally cut you off earlier. Do you want to keep going on that question that you
no,
started?
you're fine. I had a quick question for Daniel. We're talking about dialogue there, like making them feel like real conversations. I think you obviously got a lot of the story. It's there. All that is necessary is definitely great, and it's a great story. But I was curious because you talked about making it like a retro horror. Would you rather lean into making the dialogue cheesy, or would you rather lean into making the dialogue feel like real people? If you got like another that adaptation that you're talking about next.
Yeah, I think because it's meant to be in the style of older works, and it's not clear when the story's set, but I've always imagined the story to be, early 1900s. So there is a different way of speaking, and that is part of the process is to make sure that it sounds like it could fit in a different era. So yeah, that's a good question. I think I would always rather it be a little more cheesy, or at least light, I guess, kind of tongue in cheek in terms of not sounding necessarily like people sound nowadays. Um, I think realism is overrated, especially in movies. A lot of my favorites are light and cheesy, and I think there's something to be said for that. That not every single conversation needs to sound like you're hearing it down at the coffee shop. So yeah, that's definitely something that's very conscious when I'm writing this story in particular.
I
Very,
think
very
there's
cool.
something that's really key to that too, just in terms of how that comes across to people like experiencing those stories. I think if you're like totally buying in when you're like creating these things, if you're like being earnest with it and really committing to like the characters and just treating them with respect on the page or in the screen, I think that comes across to like the viewers or the readers when they're experiencing those things, like that earnestness. I know people. I try to do that too, just in general, just like make it like make the characters just be themselves. If they're goofy, they're goofy, and sort of people will buy into that. If you have that love and that passion for them on the page or on the screen, I think people will respond to that generally.
Yeah, it's a story, it's a world you're creating. It's not our world. Even
Right.
in the most realistic stories, it's a fictional world. So I think there's a lot of room to be loose with what dialogue can be, what people can sound like, and even what people and things can look like. And that there's nothing more apparent than that than in Nick's art, where things are, you know, fantastical looking, and I think I'd rather always have that than something that's brutally realistic.
Yeah, I mean that's just fun for me. Drawing on the page in general is just like it is a drawing on a page. Like have fun with that in a artistic sense. Like push that as far as you can on the page. Like I'm all about that. Trying to make it feel like it's living, breathing in its own world sort of kind of thing, you know. That's just sort of been like something I've always tried to uh, think about at least.
No, yeah. So kind of transitioning one more time, we're kind of like coming near the close, but I have a few more questions for you. So we've been talking a lot about your previous work and kind of coming to the point that you're the state that you're at right now, creatively. But to look ahead, kind of like ideas, like maybe you've considered before, maybe you haven't had time for. Is there a future in which maybe Daniel and Nick, like your characters, the Spirit of the Shadow, Pink Lemonade. I know you also have Infinite Wonders, like in a time kind of like very built on like crossovers and universes colliding. Is there a reality where those two characters can meet, or is that something you're very strongly against, or we the readers would like to know, basically?
From my perspective, I think the worlds are so different and unique that it would, I don't know if the styles and the tones would mesh together. They would probably clash. I think there's definitely a future for the Spirit of the Shadows in some sense. I mean, we've talked about what we could do in terms of a book, and as I said, I'm working on a feature screenplay, so I'm always looking for ways to continue with these characters. But I don't think we've really talked about any kind of a crossover or anything. But I'll let Nick's voice his opinion on that.
Yeah, I think we're pretty precious with the Spirit of the Shadows, like where that goes or what it interacts with in general. But I as far as like anything else goes with like Pink Lemonade and maybe some characters from the Infinite Wonders books, I'd say keep reading Pink Lemonade. You never know who might show up there. Yeah,
Yeah, you could talk about how you've reintroduced some older
oh
characters into
yeah,
Pink Lemonade.
oh yeah, yeah.
That's always
This
interested.
this isn't a spoiler, but this isn't a spoiler at all. But um, the very first thing that I worked on with one of our other friends, Tristan, it was in high school. It was a '90s parody book called Radical Force Extreme, and it was really, really bad on my part because I didn't know what I was doing. My art was horrible. Uh, and like that's the thing that I now that I see people say always is your first thing will be awful, but just power through it and you'll learn a lot just from those first few pages. And looking back, I think that was certainly a case, but that character in that book, we never really got to do anything with that character. So I ended up pulling that character over into Pink Lemonade, and they have a pretty sizable role through the whole story because there was a perfect spot for them to exist in and have an arc and complement Pink Lemonade's arc, and it just worked out really nicely.
So you
Yeah,
never know.
that's yeah,
Yeah,
that's exactly what we're curious about. Even if it's not Spirit of the Shadows directly crossing over, it's nice to know that there's always something going on in the background that's just like inserting characters because I'm sure you're coming out with more and more characters, ideas, they never stop basically. So that's very, very,
Hmm.
very cool.
yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Well, to just kind of wrap this up, I usually ask this question for everybody. In terms of advice that you may or may not, but hopefully do have for aspiring comic book writers and artists, what would you say to people who want to be where you are now one day?
Just do it. Don't think about it. Don't aspire to do it. Just do it. We both started making creative projects as early as high school and maybe even earlier than that. And as Nick said, the first ones are always going to be terrible, but you're going to learn so much. And I think it's an ongoing learning process. The way you get good at anything, but especially artistic things, is to keep doing them, learn from your mistakes. Uh, we've been talking about comics, but what we've also been doing is a lot of films. We made a lot of short films and 2 feature films, and each one is exponentially better than the one before because you just learn so much from doing it. So there's no better advice than to just start however you can, and you don't need a lot of money, you don't need a lot of talent, you don't need a lot of experience, but you'll learn so much, and finish what you start, because it's easy to abandon it, to quit, to feel like, oh, this is not going anywhere. But it's good to have that committed work ethic to actually completing something, even if it's garbage. You can try again the next time.
Yeah, always feels good to have something done. You can chart your progress that way, sort of too. Like I look at my very earliest Infinite Wonders books from like did them back in like 2013, and then it's just like every year after that, it's just you see that progress, and it's sort of it is a good motivator in some ways, just seeing like how you can push yourself and like that's one thing that I would say for like drawing comic books is you need to be good at like drawing like all sorts of crazy or mundane things, everyday objects, everyday scenarios, and push yourself to draw things you might not typically want to draw or think you would enjoy drawing. Just push yourself to do those kinds of things because uh you know real life you just walk around to the kitchen sink and maybe you'll have a scene with the character just hanging around by their kitchen sink in a book. Draw that sink right,
Yeah.
uh but yeah, and I'd say too, just don't get discouraged with rejections or searching around for publishers and stuff. Just gotta keep going on it, honestly. Uh, push through push through it. It can be hard some days for sure. But I think it's worth it in the end. When you got like something that you're proud of and can hold in your hands and say you did something,
Yeah, I think that is lovely advice for anyone in the comic book world or outside of it. So thank you both for that. I really appreciate it. Vinny, did you have any other closing remarks you wanted to make before we close this out?
I did have perhaps my boldest question of all. Is there any way Sophie and I could get autographed copies of The Spirit of the Shadows and brands making me full color? I mean, we of course we're willing to purchase them, but we just wanted to make sure that they would come with compliments of the creators. So
Oh, absolutely. I have a few copies right here, and if you give us your info, we'll take care of that for sure.
sure,
Absolutely. Who
definitely.
knows? Might even throw in some bonus stuff too.
Okay, I will definitely put in my address. I'll email it to you after the meeting, and then I'll be sure to get Sophie hers. And we really appreciate the time talking. I know going way back to when we met, it was just really motivational just to meet you. You know, as an artist, I've come a long way, and I followed your stuff as closely as I can. You know, but it's been it's been nice talking to you and really getting really into the behind the scenes of it all. You know, because I know when we met at comic conventions, it was very like, well, this is what we have and this is what we're selling, but it's nice to
Yeah.
go. It's nice to go back. You know, so.
Yeah, it's been great.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah, always appreciate it.
Mhm. No problem, yeah. And we're looking for probably November. We're gonna have this, edited, and we're hoping to get once we get that the physical comic, we'll do a review of the color edition, and then we'll kind of release it like them, in tandem. But November, who says spooky season is over? So they can go
Yeah,
on.
it's always
Sounds
spooky
good.
season over here.
yeah, and we'll send you the link to the interview and the review once it's published as well. But yeah, thank you again both for your time. We really enjoyed speaking with you today, and we wish you the best of luck on all future projects that you both have.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.